Thank you, Helen, for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and it reminded me of the project and told me something about aspects of it that I wasn't aware of before. And it also reminded me of how many people were involved. And thinking about this thing of the long conversation, I think that for all those people who were involved in different ways, I mean, I was involved in writing on the blog. It is something which has continued to kind of resonate, and there is a sense that we're all now part of the Slow Revolution network. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of things to do with the object. I mean, I was thinking that I first got to know you through being involved in the Process Works exhibition. And I was thinking about the consistency between that project and all the others, in which I really feel that there's been this focus on the practice as the location of meaning rather than the object. And I had a couple of thoughts about that, and one of them was a sort of practical one, really. I just wondered if you encountered any kind of curatorial problems yourself as a curator in putting together that exhibition, but also with the museums and institutions that you worked with.
In terms of...
Well, we have an expectation of an exhibition as being a collection of objects, finished things, rather than these open-ended objects as they were nicely described.
I think that that I have seen that thinking change over time. So I remember when I was first showing my work in the 1990s, early 1990s, there was more tension then in trying to show anything other than finished object. And that even 10 years later, I remember wanting to show some drawings. It was actually, it was 15 years later, 10, 15 years later, wanting to show some objects from the Process Works exhibition in an exhibition that I was in, showing these final objects that I make. And they didn't want me to do that, and there was a massive tension in that. And so I've seen that change over time, because when we got to the Taking Time project, really we had to work with people, as you say, along the way, and work in sort of investing ideas from the galleries we were working with about that. So we talked about that and we talked around that. So it wasn't as if there were any big surprises about what was coming. And so there wasn't really tension at that point, but I think perhaps visitors to the gallery may have found some tension. And I suppose for me there may be a tension. I might want to see more process-based work around it. But then it's a difficulty making sense of that, which is what I'm trying to do at the moment with the side-by-side project, trying to make sense of sort of a performance process, what we understand through what's left behind of a process. Can we tell what's been going on or what may be about to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a reference made in your talk to the thumbprint, which is a rather sort of clumsy image of the evidence of the making process. But I think through my own research, where I've filmed people making, I've become more and more convinced that the process is really in there as part of the content of the work, and actually, in some ways, when you start to pay attention to it, it transcends all the other sort of, more overtly narrative or philosophical ideas that might be in the object. We experience something of the experience of the maker through looking at it, and I think that's sometimes to do with time, the time that it's taken to make something becomes quite sort of evident, and we become drawn into that kind of looking very slowly and deeply into something in a way that you do when you're making.
Yeah, and I suppose what I've become more interested in is the fact that these objects have agency. So whilst people maybe think in terms of sustainability or development that we don't need more objects, then how as humans can we understand the world without them? Well, we can't. We've got them all around us, and we engage with people through objects. We engage with the world through objects, and they'll be here when we have gone. We're engaging every day with objects that, say, in this room that belonged to people before us. And I think that for me, it's not about taking that away. It's just part of a wider process. And what I wanted to show with some of the people that I talked about today is really that that's a wide process. It's not just about making an object that then exists as some untangible thing that's not connected to the world. There are major connections that they're making to the past and the present, the future, through the work that they're making in very profound ways. So, the importance of that.
I'm very attracted by this idea of the open-ended object, I suppose for that reason, because we quite often see art objects as something completely finished. And I like them, this idea of them as a kind of almost as a starting point, not just a resting point, but starting point for something further. And I was also thinking about this thing of going backward and forward in time and so on, and about craft making is one of the things which I think is very special about craft making is that it's even when we talk in terms of innovation and so on, it tends to be rooted in traditions of making and traditions of knowledge and a shared knowledge and shared standards, as Richard Sennett has pointed out. And I think that there's something quite sort of humbling about that, which is quite contrary to the kind of star system that thinking about the relationship between what we're talking about today and collect. There's something about that idea of the maker as a kind of very special kind of individual person with special skills and special insight, and this idea of us all working within a tradition.
Well, I think that's why I found the work of Amy Houghton very compelling, and I think I gave a quote from Shelley Goldsmith earlier in my talk as well about the unpicking of something and how you understand an object or how it's been made or the people involved in that, perhaps in an unmaking process. And I think that's really interesting in that idea of restoration, that in order to know how to restore something, you have to understand how it's been made in the first place. And I think there's something very, very much about social relationships in that and how we understand. If we can understand that sort of unpicking of something and how something's been put together, perhaps we can work with it in a different way. And I suppose that for me is the interesting thing about that sort of unfinished object, or open-ended object, that it has that space for being unmade or remade or reconfigured.
There's a very nice phrase that Jane used in the report, making as a shared and continuous conversation. I think that's and again, that's very contrary to this notion of a singular, special maker.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a sort of ambivalence, I guess, to that singular notion. And again, I suppose there's a tension because I do work alone quite a lot. And I think Sarah brought that up yesterday, that there are times when you need to be alone as well, in that sort of deep purpose of trying to get somewhere with your ideas or your making. But I think that idea of sharing ideas, sharing language, sharing conversation, and even I think the fact that we're having a conversation now, and we use that a lot in our work. I see that as a very sort of very akin to a making process of how you put something together.
Yeah.
So conversation is very like that, putting something together, and again, it's a shared activity.
Mm. So you're in dialogue with the material, but you're also, I mean, I've talked to Malcolm Martin about this. Malcolm Martin is a woodcarver, working in a very contemporary way, but he says that when he stands at the bench, he's very conscious of using tools that have been shaped over generations and have been used by thousands, millions of people, and that are essentially the same tools that have been used since man first started using tools, really, a hammer and a chisel. So there is this, even when you're in that kind of singular reflective space, there is this sense of being kind of inward looking, but also kind of drawn outwards as well, looking outwards and beyond yourself.
And I think perhaps in that, the sense of the objects, I was just having a conversation over tea about objects not being inanimate. They're not inanimate. They play, they have their own lives. They circulate. I was just saying to Trude, the piece she's wearing today is made by an old student of mine who lives in Norway, and so immediately that connection, things circulate, move around, and give us connection. So I think in the studio again, and Malcolm's comment of that connection, I've got a series of tools that were that I bought from a man who was selling all his tools off. He'd worked in Hatton Garden in London, in the Jewellery Quarter, and a lot of these tools are fascinating because they've been remade over time. They didn't just belong to him, and some of them you can't even work out because they've been repurposed and had something done to them to perform something quite particular. And I've got this. I did a project last year with it called The Tool at Hand, which was an exhibition that's touring in the US, and we were asked to just use one tool, and I chose a set of rolling mills, which belonged to this man. And actually, I was asked if that tool had personality, and I thought, well, I don't really know if it has personality. I can't, personality in terms of person, but it definitely has presence, and it sits there in my studio with presence, and it reminds me of certain things, which then I think evolve into the work somehow.
It's a fine line between sort of anthropomorphizing and recognizing that's, well, actually, that sense of connection to another human being through the things they've made or used. I wanted to, I suppose, sticking with the same sort of area, I was thinking about some of the conversations yesterday about creativity, and I got the sense sometimes that there was a danger that we were slipping into thinking of creativity as something that is just springs from nowhere and doesn't need to be nurtured and taught even. And I think that one of the things about craft knowledge again is that it pays attention to learning and developing skills over time, duration, and reiteration, doing things over and over again until you get them right, and it really values those things. And you often when I talk to makers, they talk about the kind of freedom that gives them.
But as you say, it makes me think of forgetting, and how easy it is to forget as well. That if you, and it is that durational thing that you're picking up stuff, and maybe it maybe moves you're moving somewhere with materials and developing ideas through that, but somehow you can also forget that, which I think is an interesting thing as well, sort of building something and forgetting it along the way. So I definitely think that in terms of skills, you get to the point where you forget about that. You just do, and you forget that thing of what you're doing. And I think that's the thing of doing it over time. So for me, I forgot to talk about the skills quite a long time ago, because I've been doing it for a long time, and that was just part of the vocabulary. It's almost like I don't have to talk about the ABC to talk to you or to write.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that for me is again about that long thinking, that just became part of a forgetting.
Forgetting is quite an interesting word. I mean, are we talking about skills becoming embodied, really, and knowledge becoming embodied, so that it's just part of you and you don't have to refer to it? And one of the people I filmed for my research was an amateur potter who was very committed to learning and very much in the process of learning when I was filming her. And she kept talking about the things that she was doing self-consciously and that she needed to forget. She needed to just be able to do it without looking. That was what she aspired to.
Yeah, I suppose that it's two things. One is sort of forgetting and just doing, and the other is forgetting what you don't need. And I suppose that's another thing, the things that you can leave behind as well, about what you've learned, and moving on to the other things that maybe become important along the way.
Yeah, that's stripping back. I remember talking to Jim Partridge about that, and how he'd studied with John Makepeace, and he said that he felt that actually learning all that really highly technical stuff that he'd done with John Makepeace allowed him to just to leave it all behind and to start chainsawing big bits of timber and blowtorching them. I wonder if we could open up this conversation to the audience.
I used to work in business, and there's these terrible self-help books that you can buy, but there was one absolutely fantastic one by this guy Tim Galway. It was called The Inner Game of Tennis, the first one he wrote. And he watched people playing tennis and realised that the more he told them what to do, the less well they played. And once they trusted their own muscles and their own feelings and paid attention to that, then they suddenly started playing really, really well. And so he's developed this whole approach of, how to forget the conscious things that you do that stop you being able to play tennis well, and somehow trust your own internal feelings that allow you to play it better. And I think that happens in craft a lot. There's sort of an inner game to craft where you're sensitive to the materials, and that sensitivity to the material allows you, you learn from that. And the less you try and apply rules to it and think your relationship with the material, the better. But it's weird where the idea of learning and forgetting, comes from sometimes.
I think, and I suppose for me, in that sense, and thinking about making, so making as a broader subject, working with Layla, the dancer, and we were, Paul uses film in his work. He films people working and then talks back through what they're seeing. And actually this happened to me then in this dance project where we were being filmed almost all the time. And it was a real revelation to me watching some of these films. Some of the films I didn't realise that we were being filmed. And I'd suddenly see my hands at work and doing things that I thought, they're not my hands. So I would see my hand hovering and obviously thinking about something. But also the other thing that I found very interesting, and this probably reflects on the tennis players as well, was the subconscious going on. So there are many times when we're in the room working side by side and we're doing the same thing, and yet we're not looking at each other, we're not, but we're ostensibly, if you look, we're doing the same thing or going through something of the same thing. And I find that endlessly fascinating, how you can tune in with somebody in the room. And I think this is really interesting about actually the singular, being in the room working by yourself or being with others, that you can tune in. And I miss that tuning in sometimes when I'm by myself, actually.
I was just, when you were talking about the tennis player, I was thinking about, I once went to watch a recording of a piece of minimalist music, and it was a small chamber orchestra, and I was really fascinated by the way the musicians worked, and this music is very highly repetitive with very small incremental changes, and I was amazed at the way they would play through a piece and then they would stop, and one of the violinists would say, or the composer would come out and say, how was that? And one of the violinists would say, it was fine, but I think line 23, note 10, I was just a little bit out there, and I was amazed that they could, with the nature of the music and with the number of notes, that they could be that specific and be that attentive to what they were doing. And then later on, there came a point where there was one piece where they kept doing it over, and it was always not quite right. And in the end, the engineer came out and said, "That's great. We'll move on to the next piece now." But you kind of knew it wasn't, and they came back to it at the end, and you realised that what was happening was that kind of attentiveness had kind of tipped over. And so they'd stopped being loose and fluid, and they were paying too much attention. And I think that's something we can recognise when we're making sometimes.
No, it was really just a sort of past comment on that lovely phrase that you had about making as a shared and continuous conversation. That is such a rich expression, because I think that there are probably several voices, multiple voices engaged in that, and they fade in and fade out at different times. Sorry, I'm fading out. And they fade in and fade out at different times, and I think obviously, as you talked about the agency of the material, there are voices, not singular, but plural voices from the material, voices as one understands oneself going through the process, so one's setting up multiple selves almost in dialogue, and voices to do with an imagined community of makers, an audience, etc., that might be watching this, or somehow this is played for in some senses. So I think that sense of a conversation really goes to, well, the heart, that's not really the right word, but goes quite close to what's going on perhaps in some cases.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk, and I think that social change happens when people start to think differently. And in our time, I think it's very, very important to reflect on time and let the objects actually make time visible. Because how does time look, and how do you sense time? I'm a maker and I'm also a teacher. And if I show the young students a piece of work that I may have used month on making, they think, wow, how did you have a month? How can you have that time? And ask them, what did you do in these months? Oh, we don't know. But I can actually show them 2 months. How does 2 months look? And I can show them actually a special, an exact month, or exactly a time, a special time, because I can put date to it and year to it, and they can't show me anything from those months. So.
One of the artists I filmed did a series of drawings of bits of wire, and they were extraordinarily rendered. He spent a lot of time preparing the surface that he was going to draw on, and they're incredibly realistic drawings of almost nothing. You know, they're literally little bits of twisted wire, and I was really fascinated by them because the first thing that struck me about them was that there's nothing going on here, yet I'm completely drawn into them, and I was drawn into the time that it took him to really do them and to observe this piece of wire. He talked about how he starts off with very, very hard pencil and gradually builds up, goes going softer and softer. And he says that when he starts with the hardest pencil, he's just feeling the object. He's being with the object, and I really love that description.
Tools and the connections with the people that have used them, because in my workshop I have my grandmother's hammer, and so sometimes just picking it up connects me with my grandmother and all her ways of being in the world. And she'd repaired it, and quite crudely really, it's got a sort of nail shoved into it and then bent over to hold the head in place. And so for years there's been this conversation between my grandmother and myself going on when I've used the hammer. And last year my son used it and the hammer head flew off. And I've been using that hammer for 25 or more years and never, ever, ever had that effect. So now when I use it, I'm sort of thinking about my son and what did he do and how did it happen? And there's this wonderful sort of sense of family and continuity all embodied in this hammer, which is not breaking anymore.
I'm a filmmaker as well. I was wondering if you could, and I often work with this sort of material, could you talk about the process and whether you were making a documentary or it's purely for recording, and also how how the cross people reacted to the filming?
These are films that I've made purely for research purposes, and what I do is I film the artist or maker working, and then I film an interview with them while they're looking at themselves working, so that we can talk about, well, we can talk about all kinds of things that are about the practice. We can talk about embodied knowledge, and we can talk about how something feels, and the experience of making. And the reaction is fairly consistent, actually. They tend to, because it's a question that I always ask at the end of the interview, you know, what did you think about this experience? And they always talk about how they didn't realize how coherent their practice was, and how fluid things were. Because one of the things that always strikes me is you go into a workshop and they tend to be quite sort of, to the outside viewer, they're often quite chaotic looking. There are tools everywhere and bits of materials and half-finished bits of work. And it's only when you see the practitioner sort of moving around, you kind of really, you recognize that actually everything is exactly where it needs to be. So going back to their responses, yeah, they tend to find it very interesting to see themselves, and I think it's a really useful tool for reflection in that way, and I think it's quite revealing for them. But also, I think most of them found it a very positive, reassuring thing.
Connections over time. we've been talking about the whole thing is about process and slowness and time, to do the film over a number of years and then perhaps follow the objects that are involved. And
I mean, my approach was to be very kind of open. I didn't have a set of questions that I wanted to be answered. I wanted to be responsive to the material, really, and I wanted their accounts more than anything else. But of course, reviewing the films after the event, certain things emerge that you think, well, it would be really nice to explore that a bit further. And
can we make this the last one, and then we'll do a break?
Hi, Helen. Were the artists that you worked with on Making a Slow Revolution, did they see their objects as open-ended? Is that how they would have described them?
I don't know if I could answer for all of them, because I may not have had the right conversation or that conversation. So I suppose I don't know. Truthfully, I don't know. I suppose in the people that I spoke about today, I could probably say yes, because of their process as well. And I maintain contact with them, and I know what they're doing now and see how they work. And also, I suppose in the first instance, we were interested in people that maybe were doing that. But I have to say, that's in the benefit of hindsight. As I said, that's now looking back. Maybe I wasn't even aware that I was looking for that at the time.
And do you think that open-endedness, that was the thing that kind of sparked those conversations with the audience? Do you think that was...
I think the open-ended nature is really helpful in that conversation, because you feel that you can join in.
Yeah.
You feel that you can have the conversation, that you can allow the open space. So that open space, or the silence, the edge of something, the room for that, I think, yeah. And we purposely actually didn't have a lot of, what do you call it, interpretation.
Mm.
And actually some people were fairly critical of the lack of interpretation. But it was me that was really strong on that. I wanted people to maybe make their own thoughts about that. And actually the two pieces I showed at the end, the Shane Waltner and the Amy Houghton in combination, and the cards that came out of the Amy Houghton piece, which I hope one day she'll be able to make into something more, show something of that open-ended process, because there was actually a feedback frame. It's interesting when you work on an exhibition like that, there is quite, I found there was tension, because there was a lot of stuff that had to be done for interpretive reasons. So the galleries had policies which meant they had to have interpretation and they had to have feedback. So there was quite a lot of feedback stuff going on, which is really about funding. So there was a feedback frame where people could leave their comments. And then there was Amy's piece that was a piece of art. And for me, that's where the profound comments came.
That
where
provoked the comments.
Where there was an engagement going on in the work, instead of just being asked, is it good or bad?
Yeah. Did you like it?
Yeah, did you like it? And so I think that was there because that happened because it was open-ended. Yeah, it allowed a room for somebody to make their thoughts real. Yeah.